Welcome back to Sputnik. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, is a series of trade negotiations being carried out between the EU and the US. As a bilateral trade agreement, TTIP is about reducing the regulatory barriers to trade for big business.
Issues such as food safety law, environmental legislation and banking regulations are all affected by the new trade deal. Yet, despite its importance and the impact these deals are likely to have on Britain and the European Union as a whole, they are conducted in secret with very little transpiring in the media.
Described as an assault on European and US societies by transnational corporations by War on Want's Executive Director John Hillary, TTIP has the potential to affect every single one of us. To explain in detail why is member of Stop TTIP expert group, Dr Lucy Reynolds. Lucy, we know that something is being conducted in secret, and we know that there is concern amongst the general public. But before we go into that, can you just tell us a bit about what TTIP is and what it represents?
Certainly. It's known as a trade deal, but it's one in a series of trade deals around the world. And generally in the past, trade deals have been aimed at reducing barriers to trade, so that's sort of customs tariffs, that kind of thing. This one isn't, because those tariffs are already very low between the parties to this, which is the European Union and the USA. And we have a parallel agreement about to be signed, actually, even earlier, September, October maybe, with a forthcoming day of action against it in May, which is the Canadian equivalent, which is called CETA. But the TTIP deal would tie the US and the European Union into a single market. And the changes in it, well, as you say, it's very hard to find out what's in it, actually. They've required people who go and look at it, only members of the European Parliament and MPs. They're allowed to go in, but they're not allowed to take any notes that they can take out, or any photographs or anything like that. They're not allowed to take the text out. So we don't really know exactly what's in it, but we have had some information about it, mainly from the way they kind of advertise it, which is not all that convincing. So we see that there's going to be unification of standards, which will generally be down to the US level, because that's the form for trade agreements around the world. And so we're going to lose a lot of protections that we have in the European Union and in Britain, because if they are inconvenient to the profit stream of foreign corporations, American corporations, who are allowed to do things a different way at home, they can very likely be able to claim that they can reduce the standards so that they will be able to trade on equal terms. So that's likely. And also a very major target of it is, in fact, the privatisation of public services in Europe. There's a lot of floating free capital that's looking for investment opportunities, and honestly, tapping outsourcing money from public services and privatisation streams generally is easier than earning an honest living in fierce competition against each other. So that is a big part of TTIP, and that, in fact, is the thing that brought it to our notice, the threat to the NHS that it represents, because in 2012 an instruction was given in internal EU circles in Brussels to start the harmonisation, or complete if that had already been started, of national legislation on public services to US standards in preparation for TTIP, and delegates to that meeting were told that the priority sector was the healthcare sector. So obviously, since the NHS is in an English-speaking country and the US is an English-speaking country, the NHS is the big target.
We know that the NHS is obviously in the line of fire, as it were, and that's been sort of mentioned quite a few times. But what are the areas that the public really should be concerned about, other than the NHS?
Well, we've got form from the trade treaty mob on food quality standards. So there's been fights in the past over hormone-treated beef coming into the EU. We've been able to block that because we have higher standards, but we won't be able to enforce those any longer. So we're going to lose those sorts of protections. And unfortunately, trade law it's not really a set of laws. It's a kind of regime written by the corporations for the corporations, enforceable against the people by their governments, who have to be induced to go along with this somehow. And under those arrangements, everything is very much swung towards the big corporate interest. So where there are points at issue, they are decided through secret trade tribunals, staffed by their people, They don't publish any information about the decisions, and they don't have to follow precedent. So basically, they're kind of making it up as they go along for them and their cronies. And therefore, what looks on paper like something reasonable, for example, the exemption for public health services, actually is very tight indeed. So as well as standards right the way through the economy, but particularly around health and safety standards, we're basically looking at a situation where the NHS is going to be forced into a situation of full privatisation to look very much like US healthcare, unless we're able to renationalise it pretty much immediately. And the political will to do that is obviously hard to come by at the moment, because our politicians are generally trying to encourage the TTIP deal and are trying to kind of market it to us. Although those that find out about what's actually in it tend to be rather more critical, and Peter Lilly MP has come out this last week against TTIP. I think he's probably been reading our literature, actually. He's really quite well informed, and he quite correctly points out that the thing is a heist and we should have nothing to do with it. So even people like that are coming out, you know, there's a sign of...
Never mind Peter Lilly MP. Donald Trump has even, you know, raised concern over this TTIP deal, and he is obviously the big successful businessman. So if even he is raising question marks, then who is behind this TTIP deal?
Well, I mean, I think it's a conglomerate of corporate interests. John Perkins, in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, about his time at the forefront of the privatisation wave, explained that after the oil shocks in the 1970s, when the oil-producing countries, which weren't the general centres of power, got together as a bloc and exerted some of that power back in the opposite direction, at that point, there developed a very tight cartel of power between the different interests. So industrial interests, extractive interests, banking interests, and the general kind of hierarchy, locked in much, much tighter. And the trade lobby is a representation of that. I mean, it's been going in its present form since the Second World War, with the launch of the Bretton Woods organisations, the World Trade Organisation, the IMF, and the World Bank. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a hydra-headed thing, and all of the marketing that it puts out is just lovely. But actually, when you look at the nitty-gritty, that's where the problem comes. And it's very important to note in this connection that we can't see the text of the TTIP agreement or the CETA agreement or really any of it openly. My master's dissertation back in the 1990s involved analysing the actual legal text of what was supposed to be a poverty initiative. And oh boy, what was in that? It was disgusting. Basically, it was like, well, we'll give you some money because you're starving, but you have to turn over all your public services on the worst terms. So really, you know, TTIP and the like is just one in a line of a series of corporate takeovers. And unless we resist it, really quite forcefully, it will go through. However, resistance to it is not impossible, because the whole reason that they're at the moment trying to patch together the regional trade treaties around the world into a single net is because they lost at the last round. In 2001, in the Doha meeting of the World Trade Organization, there was a push to get through the General Agreement in Trade and Services, which would have basically kind of forced open all public services globally on the same sort of terms. And the activists won the battle, which is why, they basically stalemated it more than anything, so this is why we're now facing this. So public awareness is growing, actually.
How close are we to this TTIP deal being signed?
Well, in some ways it looks like the inevitable march, really, because our politicians are going along with it. So we really need an exceptional pushback, I think, to educate them more than anything, because anybody that does actually look at it sees that it's completely outrageous.
So what are the groups that are actually getting involved in challenging this TTIP? Because, I mean, obviously, again, the secrecy means that people are simply not alarmed enough to attempt to challenge it. Are there other groups such as yours that are involved in sort of trying to get answers from the government and actually pushing for reversal of these agreements?
Well, yes, actually, that mobilisation has gone pretty well. It's been fairly spontaneous, but headed by a very effective activist called Linda Coucher, who was in that meeting in Brussels in 2012 when she heard that our public services were about to go down. And so it's gone from one person back then to a national network. There's an expert group which works on the inside, and then a dissemination group called No TTIP. We've got a newspaper here. So various initiatives to spread the word around the country. I've done a fair amount of speaking on this, despite the fact that it's you know, in many ways not my primary area of interest. I'm very worried about the NHS privatisation in particular. We have a little bit of kind of feedback on this, if you like, a little bit of market research from the fact that many MPs reported that they were going around canvassing for the election and were being treated to education on TTIP on the front doorsteps of their constituents by their constituents, which is actually pretty impressive from one person only a few years ago. But, you know, the content of this is really very frightening.
Very, very briefly, is it still reversible?
Well, yes, it is. You know, if what was really a fairly kind of ad hoc bunch of third world activists and a few people in the first world who are technicals who came to assist them, if that can stalemate the thing, it's possible to do that, but we need to make people aware. So thank you very much for giving the issue the exposure. In particular, this is a very big threat to the NHS. Unless we can renationalise the NHS immediately, this is really the end of it.
Dr Reynolds, I'll have to stop you there. Thank you very much. You've been a great guest.